Welcome to video 1 on chapter 20, America is Hyperpower. Remember, this is the title called The Strength of a Giant, right? So again, after the end of the Cold War, the United States was seen as the only global superpower. So we're going to split this chapter in half, as you can see here. So although it goes from 1992 to 2007 or 2008, so remember, George W. Bush doesn't come into the White House until January 2001. So this will be the latter half of those years. So obviously, when we speak about George W. Bush, it's hard to think about his presidency without 9/11. Because you think, again, if you think about that he came into office in January 2001, he was still fairly early on when 9/11 happened, right? So this would just be about a little less than 8 months after his inauguration as the 43rd president. So we think about, his entire 8 years in the White House. So much of it was intertwined with the events, tragic events of 9/11. So if you remember, we started off the course looking at the Truman administration, right? The period from 1945 up until when Truman leaves office in 1953, where we really had this revolution or transformation in U.S. foreign policy. So as you can see here, your book refers to this sort of post 9/11 era as this opportunity or this way that they revolutionized changes in U.S. foreign policy since the Truman Doctrine way back in '47. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Again, 9/11 was the worst attack on the United States since Pearl Harbor way back in 1941. So again, 1941 all the way up 60 years later until 9/11, right? So as you can see here, his father, George H.W. Bush, right, of course, the 41st president of the United States. So remember, we had George Bush Sr., right? Then, of course, he lost to Bill Clinton. So George H.W. Bush just served one term in office from 1989 to 93. Then Clinton was elected for 2 terms, right, from 93. Then he serves until 2001. Then, of course, George W. Bush until 2009 when Obama assumes office. All right, so it says, face the greatest challenge of any president since Abraham Lincoln. And again, that might be a bit of an overstatement in some ways, right? I mean, think about some of the challenges, say, that Franklin Roosevelt had to get the country through with the Great Depression and, of course, World War II, these type of things. But there was this sense that 9/11 was something new and something much more difficult, perhaps, than previous presidents had to deal with. So your book talks about that overall, as far as personality, again, if we look at the individual level of analysis, the Bush had much more of a sort of narrow view or mindset compared to his father, who was much more internationalist, right? So George W. Bush, you can see here, his main experience in government beforehand was he served 8 years as governor of Texas. So again, more at the state level, and then he moved up to president of the United States. Whereas his father, George H.W. Bush, served in numerous roles. He actually fought in World War II. He was ambassador to China for a bit, and he was director of the CIA, vice president. He had a lot of different roles, so he was much more comfortable and much more familiar with internationalism and working with other countries and so forth. All right. So this next section, I just want to show you, thinking about what a lot of these folks do when they leave office. A lot of times they write books. Sometimes they can be a little bit of self-glorification, where I think a lot of people would read these things and say, it seems like everything the person did was great, and anything that maybe was seen as a failure is often blamed on others, or maybe not seen as much culpability as maybe we would like. In any case, so this is a recent book, that President Bush wrote after leaving the office, called Decision Points. So it's sort of an interesting way that he went about doing this. So instead of kind of writing like some kind of memoir thing about my years in the White House or something like that, he looks at, I think there's over 10 or 15 or so where he calls sort of key decision points, where as President of the United States, he felt that he had to make a direct decision and go from there. So again, this is a recent book that you could check out. So then what about his the folks that served as his secretaries of state, right? So if you might be familiar with these people already, right? So Colin Powell had a long military career. So he was the position called the Joint Chiefs of Staff previously, right? So again, the kind of highest official in the military, right? So then he kind of moved over into a civilian role after, later on as Secretary of State for Bush's first term. So he's the first ever African American to serve as Secretary of State, right, from '01 to '05. And then directly following him, we have Condoleezza Rice, who served for the second terms, and she's the first ever African American female to serve in that position. So she is still kind of active. She was in academia beforehand, and she returned and is currently a professor of political science at Stanford University in California. So both of these books, you can see they kind of relate it to a little bit of what they did in government. So, for example, hers says a memoir of my years in Washington. Now, again, this means more than just during Bush's presidency, but it's a little bit more about just sort of life and these kind of things, right? Like Colin Powell's book here, "It Worked for Me," for example, on life and leadership. So it's a little bit of biography, a little bit of memoir, those type of things. All right, then what about his vice president and secretary of defense, right? So, of course, Dick Cheney, probably the most controversial vice president we've had in a long, long time. In a lot of ways, a lot of people thought, maybe he was the one really sort of pulling the strings in the White House, that maybe President Bush relied on him to a degree that maybe we had not seen with previous presidents, right? Again, he had much more political experience, particularly at the federal level. I think he was a congressman, and he was also a secretary of defense. Had numerous roles before moving up to vice president. All right. So then this other guy also was a controversial figure at that time. Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense. So these are also books that they have written since their time in office. All right. So your book refers a lot to what are called neocons or neoconservatives, right? So these are this is a term that was kind of used as a label for a lot of the people in government, kind of right before, maybe in some ways, the Bush administration, but particularly during those 8 years. Maybe not such a well-known group since Obama has been in office, right? So this book you can see by James Mann, Rise of the Vulcans, talking about his war cabinet, sort of these people that really were sort of pushing the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. And there's this other book I wanted you to be aware of. It's A Plan of Attack, from this famous journalist, Bob Woodward, a journalist with the Washington Post. Again, kind of talking about the run up to war. All right, so if you think about, well, what are the neocons? What exactly does that neoconservative idea mean? So remember, neo on the front of anything just means new. So we're talking about new conservatism. So how does that differ from just plain old conservatism? So, for example, we looked at in an earlier chapter, right? During if you're thinking about during the Nixon administration, his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, pursued this détente policy with the Soviet Union. So if you remember that vocabulary term, it meant a kind of a relaxing or easing of tensions, trying to sort of cool the temperature a little bit if there's hostility and animosity between countries. So these neocons also hated the U.S. failure in Vietnam. They felt like we should have done everything possible to win that war. Sort of the way that it was, the way that war was conducted was kind of, maybe halfway there. That it really wasn't given the all that it should have been. So there's this overall sort of a perspective or outlook of maintaining total military superiority. Again, and the interest part is very important here. So the idea is, so when we're looking at a lot of the values versus interests, so a lot of what they believe relates to American national interest, right? So again, what would sort of benefit the country both in the short term and long term. So more of an assertive nationalism. And then maybe as you think about as maybe a contrast, say maybe compared to like the Obama administration, who's more comfortable, say, with multilateralism. So that means working with other countries. So again, multilateral kind of means on many levels, working with many countries. So like a climate change effort at the United Nations, for example, would be a multilateral effort, right? Of course, that involves many, many countries. Whereas the Bush administration was often much more unilateralist in their approach, kind of going it alone, shunning diplomacy, multilateralism, those kind of things. And even believed preemptive action was acceptable. So preemptive action means that the idea that you can attack an enemy that's preparing to attack you. Again, usually in United States history, the country has taken more of the mindset that only will only be aggressive when called upon, right? So more of a defensive measure. Whereas this one, again, you can see how that will be kind of controversial because it's sort of the idea that you're sort of arguing that an attack was going to happen, right? So again, say a preemptive strike, for example, means that you were never attacked by the other side. You just think that they were preparing to do that, and you're trying to sort of beat them to the punch. All right. So this is from your book here, right? So how did other sort of countries and other maybe other folks who were critical of the Bush administration, how did they view this neoconservative foreign policy outlook? So it says critics at home and abroad deplored the administration's rude manners and go-it-alone methods as a new isolationism. So probably think about the phrase that, or the sentence that President Bush said one time, like he said, "You're either with us or against us." So very much sort of a binary sort of viewpoint, sort of either a 0 or a 1. It's kind of like the idea, like, well, if you're not going to be join up with the United States, and you must be against us, right? Well, of course, even a lot of our allies said, well, no, we're with you, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to agree with every little thing that you want to do. So you can see where sometimes that caused a little bit of an issue for the Bush administration. So then if we turn to the perpetrators of 9/11, right, of course, the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda. So one thing I want you to be aware of is there was a lot of disagreement in that terrorist organization over their goals in early years, and maybe even today you could say, where there's this sort of split between what we call the near enemy and then the far enemy. Whereas a lot of folks that were involved with Al-Qaeda were more regional focused, closer to home, against what they saw as apostate states. Again, these would be the sort of authoritarian governments, that they saw as against Islam, against the people. So again, the kings and other dictators in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan, Jordan, and other countries, right? Where they didn't care so much about what was going on in Europe or the United States and so forth. Where then there was another group, or another perspective. So you can see maybe where Osama bin Laden comes in a little bit more here, where there was the focus on the far enemy. So, for example, that they said, well, the U.S. is supporting these what they called apostate states, keeping these dictators and kings and so forth in power, giving them military support, financial support, all those type of things. Then, of course, also our U.S. support for Israel. So the idea there is they said, well, instead of a sort of regional jihad looking at the Middle East and North Africa, that needs to be extended to more of a global jihad, right? Again, sort of a holy war against the West. All right. So again, thinking about that near versus far enemy, there's a sort of a well-known scholar that's written a lot about this idea. So you can see his name is Fawaz Gurgis. He's currently at the London School of Economics. So you see he has a book here, The Far Enemy, Why Jihad Went Global, sort of talks about that transition from why they started looking mainly just at the region, and then to more of a global perspective as far as the sort of global struggle, what they were trying to accomplish. And then he has his more recent book, so Obama in the Middle East, kind of talks about, well, how have things changed since he's been in office. All right. So when we're looking back at 9/11, so you can see this is just a little over a month beforehand, right? So August 6, 2001, the president's daily briefing says bin Laden determined to attack in the United States. So there was a sense that the government knew what was going on. They just knew that something might happen. They just didn't necessarily, realize what was going to happen a month later. Nobody had really ever thought about the idea of someone trying to not only hijack a plane, of course that's happened before, but then try to fly it into something like the World Trade Center. We had never seen that before. All right. So we'll talk about how the government response to this changed a little bit starting in the next video. So we'll go ahead and end here, and this will start back up in video 2.